If you're just joining us again, welcome to Inside the Archives, the Art of Then with What's Your Writers Club. Before we begin to learn tonight about the many histories of solidarity and activism in our state, we wanted to offer, in lieu of a verbal land acknowledgement, an artifact that was provided by Anthony Bells, one of our panelists tonight from the Tomaquag Museum. So we're going to go ahead and share that with you visually. And thank you so much to Anthony for providing this map. It was made by Sidney Ryder in 1903. It outlines the tribal boundaries in Rhode Island when it was first colonized by the likes of Roger Williams, etc. And according to Anthony, this is as close as we may get to knowing which peoples lived where before colonization. So we just wanted to take a moment with this to reflect on this image. And we're looking forward to hearing about more artifacts from the Tomaquag Museum and from Anthony later on this evening. Maybe even a little about their upcoming Cranberry Thanksgiving too. Thank you again for sharing that with us tonight.
Welcome.
So we're excited to learn together about the many archival resources in our state, and particularly about Rhode Island stories of solidarity and activism that might inspire our own creative projects. So we've asked each of our panelists to share two artifacts from their collection that speak to this rich history and to provide us with the information about how we can access materials for inspiration and research. After all the panelists have shared, we're going to ask them a few questions and open the conversation to your questions, at which point you can drop them in the chat. If you do so before the Q&A session, we might lose them. So maybe just jot them down as the panelists share, and we'll have a specific time for that at the end. But feel free to engage with the panel in the chat with positive comments throughout. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to share our gratitude that this event was made possible through a grant funded by the National Writing Project as part of the National Endowment for the Humanities American Rescue Plan Humanities Grant-Making Program. And also a special thanks to Sarah Carr, who I believe is on the call, and also to Richard Ring at Rhode Island Historical Society for help bringing this event together. This conversation is part of a series of programs coming out of that funding that I mentioned called Activism in the Archives. And as part of this programming, we're going to be putting out a call for submissions for a zine full of Rhode Island stories of solidarity from today, or inspired by the research you go on to do in these archives that we will hear from tonight. So that call and other upcoming events and opportunities will be announced on our social media at What Cheer Club, and in our newsletter. We'll get links in the chat to this great stuff. You can follow us and subscribe to stay up to date. All right, enough from me. At a time hear from each one about their archive and their expertise. So first, I am pleased to introduce from the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, Teresa Guzman-Stokes. Teresa is the president of the 1696 Heritage Group and executive director of Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. Ms. Stokes has the professional background that includes magazine editor and published writer focusing on ethnic American history. In addition to her nonfiction, she often uses her research to inspire her fiction writing. Ms. Stokes has participated in and supervised dozens of historic preservation, genealogical, and cultural resource investigations throughout New England and Virginia, with an expertise in African American, Latin American, and Jewish history and genealogy. So with that, Teresa, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to you. Thank you so much for sharing with us tonight. We'll just have you unmute and then you'll
I thought I had done that. Well, first, thanks, Jody. I appreciate you asking me to be here today. I'm also going to apologize in advance in case our local Pitbull chorus decides to take up singing, at which point I will mute myself, get rid of them, and come back. So, as Jody said, I'm the executive director of the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. I commonly go by Sunny, as everyone is welcome to call me. And I'd love to tell you a little bit about the Black Heritage Society because we have a few exciting things going on. Our collections were in storage for over 15 years. And recently we had the great opportunity to receive a federal grant to restore the archives. And so we've moved into a building on Rhode Island College campus and are in the process of cataloging over 3,500 square feet of collections. What's exciting about it is that our collections range from colonial times to all the way up to the mid 20th century, mid to late 20th century, actually. And includes everything from historical manuscripts and documents, rare books, artifacts, sound recordings, film, just a little bit of everything you can imagine, photography, art. Really, every day I'm finding something new. I know Jody had asked us to bring 2 artifacts, but because of the process that's going on, I really can't take anything out of the building and I'm at home. But I did have one thing that we discovered the other day that I thought was pretty amazing that I'd like to show you. I know it doesn't look like much, but so we discovered this big box, and on the front of it, it said that it was biographies for a program that they were doing. But when we opened it, we found about 450 pages of a photographic index of our own catalog, of our own collections. And in it, it had 2,000 slides and just so many photographs that we can't even begin to imagine how many it's going to end up being, box after box. And that was exciting to us because when they brought the collections into the building, it was literally 4 tractor trailers of boxes. And so we've slowly been going through all of them. The reason I find this exciting is that the photographs are of people from when photography started all the way up until the 1970s. And it has everyone who was everyone in Rhode Island. So that was an exciting find for us. We're finding things every day. Yesterday, we were looking through a box to clean things out and found over 150 love letters that, and I won't mention the name of the person right now because we haven't, kind of cleared out what his estate, wanted us to do with these. But it's amazing because he was in World War II and was writing home. And so it's really giving us a real feel of how African heritage people were reacting to the war, how they were involved in the war, and how they felt on the home front about everything that was going on in Europe. So that's another thing that I think is going to really inform a lot of the history that we're doing, because we have done a whole exhibit and study of what we call Sable Soldiers, which was World War I. And now we get to go into World War II. As I said, it's an exciting time for us. Unfortunately, it's also a time when the archives are mostly closed to the general public as we're going through them. However, for the purposes of this, we've agreed to Jody to open up for the month of October by appointment. Dr. Cummings, who is our Director of Cultural Engagement, gave me a whole sheet she wanted me to read. So I will do this. She says that the availability will be by appointment only on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays from 10 to 1 p.m., 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. You can email either my direct email address, which Jody provides on the PDF that she has for you, or you can email reference@ribblackheritage.org. We ask that if you're making an appointment to find something, that you be specific about what you're looking for, because we will have to go searching for it. So it helps if you know the person, or the place or the organization that you're trying to research. However, that said, I know as a writer how important it is to be able to just sometimes see things to get inspiration. And if you want to make an appointment because you're looking at a time period and in Rhode Island's history and not specifically a person or an organization, you can also call us and let us know that. And let us know, look, I'm writing about X and I'm really trying to get a feel for the people that were in Providence at that time. And that gives us the opportunity to pull things that we know that were important in Providence and people that were important and pull that for you so that you can see that. We're kind of flexible in that sense because we understand that not everyone is a historical researcher and not necessarily delving into one specific thing, but perhaps is just trying to flesh out a time or a character. And so because of that, if you can give us a general idea of what you're hoping to get out of it, we can find something that works for you. Jody, I hope I'm doing okay on time because I don't know how long I've been talking.
You're doing great. You can take a couple more minutes if you need it.
Okay, well, no, I just want to reiterate that the Black Heritage Society is really happy to be doing this because we're working right now with a photographer who's documenting and doing a documentary on the archives. We've also done programs on art and on food, and we've yet to really had the chance to work with writers. And so that is something that I would like to see happen, perhaps for a future program, that we could have particularly writers of color come in using the archives and perhaps even sharing their work with us at that time. And again, if anybody has any questions, I'll take those at the end when Jody has her Q&A. And thank you again for having me here.
Thank you so much, Sunny. We really appreciate all that great information. I know it's a special time for the collection, an exciting time, also kind of a time of transition. So we appreciate you coming in and then also opening up that access, and your insights into the kind of writing process as a writer yourself are greatly appreciated as well. Thank you so much. All right, save those questions for Sunny for the end. We're going to go to our next panelist, Richard Ring from the Rhode Island Historical Society. Richard is Deputy Executive Director for Collections and Interpretation at the Rhode Island Historical Society. Originally from Columbus, Ohio, he majored in English at the Ohio State University and worked in an array of bookshops for several years. He holds an MLS from Indiana University, specializing in rare books librarianship, and his former professional positions were at the John Carter Brown Library, the Providence Public Library, and the Watkinson Library at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. Rick, thank you so much for being with us and sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you, Jody. Thank you, everybody, for allowing me this time to talk with you. I'm not going to go through what we have at the Historical Society. It'll be longer than you guys need, and you have our website. And so I will be putting a couple of things in the chat, specific web addresses. And I'll say them now, but I'll put them in the chat in a little bit. But basically, our online list of finding aids, that's for our manuscript collections. That'll give you a really great idea of the range of manuscript sort of original records that we have, from businesses to cultural organizations to movements, et cetera. Some of those finding aids are online, some of them are not. I mean, bear in mind that our most valuable resource is our resource. It's the staff at the research center that really, dig into these collections every day and help thousands of people a year access those collections. And we are really trying in our 200th year now to make sure that everything is accessible as possible. We've been doing several sort of grant-funded projects to do that, and I can talk about that too in the Q&A. But the thing that I was going to focus on in terms of time period of activism. Not many people think the early 19th century when they think of activism. They think of the late 19th century with suffrage and the vote, et cetera, and temperance and all kinds of things. But One of the most important chapters in Rhode Island history happens in around 1840-42, and it's called the Dorr War or the Dorr Rebellion. And I don't know how many people here know about it. Maybe most people do. If that's the case, fabulous. If that's not the case, certainly is a struggle that is very relevant to today, in the sense that it was about enfranchisement. It was about who gets to vote, who does not, who's represented, who is not, and how to change it, right? And so I'm going to present a ridiculously simplified overview of the Dorr Rebellion, skipping over tons of details that are fascinating, but I will offer to anyone on this call, while supplies last, a free copy of the broadsides of the Dorr Rebellion. If you email me separately, first come, first serve. I actually don't know how many copies we have, but I know there are several boxes. So if you would like a copy of this, this special offer, you go ahead and put that in an email to me, and that would be great. So I've got my stopwatch going because I like to be within my time. So I'm going to share my screen with a couple of items here, and I think I'm going to start with this one. Hopefully everyone can see this suffrage meeting on Jefferson Plain, April 17th, 1841. This just gives you there wasn't really any photography, or if there was, it wasn't widely available at this point, but this is a representation of several thousand people that are gathering for this.
Rick,
yeah.
you might have to switch. We're just in your file browser. And
Okay,
I think
sorry.
once you clicked on the image, you needed to reshare.
Let me try that again.
Just because I really want to see this.
Yep. Nope. This always kind of maybe happens. Here we go, and here we go. How's that?
Perfect.
Okay, good. So what was the Dorr Rebellion about? Believe it or not, in the 1840s, you actually have to go back to 1663, the Royal Charter of 1663. Why? Because Rhode Island being Rhode Island, it sort of, once it has a good idea, it just hangs on to it past all possible use. It just sort of, so the 1663 Charter was a fabulous document that essentially made Rhode Island one of the freest colonies in the British Empire at the time, 1663, right? In terms of its independence from Great Britain, we could make our own laws, we could create our own government, essentially, and there was and sort of practice liberty of conscience, separation of church and state. Well, that charter was so, Rhode Islanders held on to that for so long that even after we achieved independence, we didn't create a new constitution like many states did. We just used the Royal Charter as our form of government. That is, it told us, it laid out the way that we appointed representatives in the state. So Newport, in the General Assembly, Newport got 6, and Providence got 4, Warwick got 4, and Portsmouth got 4. Those are the 4 founding towns. And then everybody else got 2. So what that meant in 1790 was very different than what that meant in 1840, because between 1800 and let's say 40, Providence triples in size. Rhode Island certainly grows because of immigration and industrialization. So what you have is these swelling urban areas, and the rural areas, they're gaining, but not very, very much. But by 1840, okay, only white males with property worth $134 could vote, that meant that only 42% of white males could vote. It also meant that 58 of white males, all women and all people of color, could not vote, right? And so further to that, the rural towns, because they had more votes in the General Assembly proportionally, controlled the General Assembly. And even further than that, the problem with the charter, which of course was the structure of government, you couldn't amend it, and there was no Bill of Rights, right? So there was no way to change it unless you got the people in power to change it, and they would of course never change it because they were in power, and why would they give that up, right? This is, again, gross oversimplification of the entire process. But what happens is then Thomas Wilson Dorr, and I'm not sure if I'm going to screw this up. Can you now see the other image? Okay, I'm gonna go again, back there he is. He is a lawyer and one of the people who are enfranchised, but he's also one of the people moved to change the system. And so he is he actually also happens to be the Rhode Island Historical Society treasurer at the time. But anyway, he is the person who begins to foment this resistance. And so, long story short, because we're at 7 minutes and 45 seconds, he and the People's the Suffrage Committee, the Suffrage Association, hold a referendum. They hold a vote, and they create a constitution called the People's Constitution, and they try to pass it by a majority vote. And then the charterists, the other side, hold their own vote. And furthermore, they hold their own vote and pretend that the other vote never happened. And they also pass a law saying that if you try to change the charter without our say-so, you are subject to treason. You're treasonous. And so sort of hijinks ensue. I mean, honestly, Dorr actually goes and gets promises from other states of troops, and they actually have a couple of armed, not very serious, but some armed conflicts. Lots of, there's a Supreme Court case. Everybody in the country is looking at what's going on in Rhode Island and kind of shaking their heads and saying, "What the heck?" But at the end of the day, it was one of the early challenges to the federal Constitution, because basically, it forced the question as to the extent to which the federal government could or should interfere with a sovereign state to enforce a Republican form of government, that is a supreme power of a body of citizens to vote for representatives. And the national reaction, some scholars say, to the Dorr War may have laid the basis for the angry reaction to the secession of the southern states in 1861. So it's a very interesting time of sort of like unrest, resistance, and just people messing with each other, trying to get what they need. And so again, vast oversimplification, but we do have lots of things in the collection, lots of broadsides, some of Dorr's letters, and certainly publications, articles on the Dorr War. And it's fascinating, and it's a really great sort of turning point. He doesn't win, but he kind of wins, and we do end up with a new constitution with broader enfranchisement, and there's lots more to the story, but that's the 10-minute version. Okay.
Thank you so much, Rick. I like that. He doesn't win, or he wins, but he kind of wins. He doesn't win. That's how it always is in politics. That's how things move forward, I guess, it seems. Thank you so much for sharing those artifacts. And we have information on the access hours. If you haven't had a chance to stop by the collection, it's a beautiful space. I just got a tour from Rick the other day, and it was both overwhelming and inspiring. There's a lot there, so I encourage everyone to dig in. All right. I want to introduce our next panelist, Ashley Salima. Ashley serves as State Archivist and Public Records Administrator for Rhode Island. Ashley holds a master's degree in Library and Information Science and a master's degree in Public Administration. As a native Rhode Islander, Ashley is passionate about connecting others to local history, cooking, and her chickens. And Ashley comes to us from the Rhode Island State Archives. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you for having me. And for my very brief bio, that Oxford comma is very important about cooking, comma, and her chickens. Thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about the archives. I, like Rick, also set myself a timer, so we'll see how I do. And I'm going to actually share my screen because I, at least, am a very visual person. So I was hoping to walk you through some a bit about the archives with a little bit of help. So we are just talking about some of the great highlights of the collection today. See if I can get my presentation to move. There we go. So the Rhode Island State Archives, if you're not aware, actually falls under the purview of the Department of State. Very brief version is we are one of 3 public-facing divisions of the department, but our primary focus is the preservation of the state's governmental history, which sounds dry, but hopefully by the end of my 10 minutes, you'll see that it's not so dry, and it's the records of the people of Rhode Island and how they influence the decisions of the decision makers of Rhode Island. The treasures at the state archives, these numbers seem really big, but they probably don't even tip the iceberg. So we have records dating back to 1638. That is our oldest document. It is the Portsmouth Compact founding the town of Portsmouth. When we say more than 10 million records, those are individual records. Just one census has 1 million index cards in it. So we get to that number pretty quick. And one of the things I'm hoping you'll pull back from my talk with you today is all of the resources that are online. Similar to when Rick spoke about his finding aids, the State Archives has a really fantastic catalog and digital archives that you can do a lot of research from home. And that's actually what I'm going to encourage from you guys today. First, I'll tell you where we physically are. If you, like me, are a lover of the physical record and you really want to come in and visit us, you can absolutely do that. If you have ever been to us before, we actually moved in the middle of 2020, perfect time, middle of a health crisis. So we moved just around the corner. We're now at 33 Broad Street in this perfectly white cube building. If you are a native Rhode Islander, it used to be the Blue Cross Blue Shield building and also the J. Johnston & Wells bookstore. Not super hard to find, right at the top of the hill, no longer in a flood zone for those of you that were ever in our old space. So very, very briefly, I just wanted to highlight some of the things that you can find. There are research opportunities for all sorts of projects. We have dissertation students come in, we have doctoral students who visit us, we have RISD professors have brought their classes in, and then we also have genealogists. So this is a hit list of the things that I wanted to make sure you knew you could find. You can increase your knowledge of state history. We also have a lot on the Door War that Rick mentioned. It's a fantastic piece of history. I'm so glad he picked that because I struggled not to pick that one. You can also discover family stories. We have people come in every day that trace family trees. You can also dive into the collection and find those untold stories and those hidden histories, those hidden collections. We currently have an exhibition up at the archives called Undefeated, which is about the undefeated basketball teams at Central High School. And in building that exhibit, we spoke with members of the community. And one of the important things that we found through that process is we had so many records that were in line with the stories from these community members, but we would not have known to look for them if they hadn't told us their stories. So those untold stories are there. They just require the right research question to get to the bottom of, which is why I was excited when Jody invited me today, because it is stories like the ones that I know that you are likely building. They're going to help discover more of those untold stories. So I'm going to dive right in. So the 2 things I wanted to show you, part of the reason I did a PowerPoint for you is I wanted to give the visual without holding up the document because they're thin. So I actually picked 2 petitions for you. If you are looking to understand more about advocacy and working together, especially through stories of adversity or pivotal moments in history, the petitions at the State Archives are going to be where you're going to find those specific stories. It is where everyday Rhode Islanders made a point of making their voices heard. This first petition was for equal access to education for African Americans. It's from 1864. It was submitted to the General Assembly, and it has this beautiful quote in it, where as they're speaking to the government about the importance of public education and that all children should have access, they provided this beautiful tidbit that education by public schools, like the sunlight of heaven, should be free to all. And as you go through these documents, that when you hear government document, that sounds very official and very stuffy and like it should be in a basement. Not that any record should be in a basement, but that's the impression we're left with. But then we get to see the beauty of language in things that were probably very hard and struggling moments for community members. But we get to explore that and explore that vulnerability through the record and see that their effort paid off. The second one is actually another petition, but this one a little bit later, 1876, and this was for enacting of halftime schooling for children. So we also did an exhibition a couple of years ago called Laboring for Justice, about activism specifically for children and those working in the mills and other industrial environments here in Rhode Island. I found this particular one interesting because it was also about schooling, but from a completely different lens. This was a petition for children to not just be siphoned into the factory, that they would still get at least a half day's worth of education. The quote I pulled out from this one was actually the fact that it talked about the effects of the old world and affording the strong value of education. So again, these are only 2 petitions of the thousands and thousands that we have dating back to the earliest days of the colony. We have petitions for divorce. When you talk about hidden stories, one of my favorites, if you've ever followed the work of historian and author Elaine Crane, she wrote a book called The Poison Plot, which is actually about Benedict Arnold of Newport, and that his young wife was attempting to poison him. So he filed for divorce through petition to the General Assembly. And that petition is part of our collection at the archives. So petition can cover all sorts of topics and all sorts of things because government was involved in many areas of life in different ways than it is now. And we get to see these personal aspects of stories. So even though the state archives in general does not have personal correspondence, which is one of my personal sadnesses, there is a lot of really deep personal content still throughout because the people are what make the government, which is what makes Rhode Island unique and special and what it is. And these petitions are one of the ways we see those stories. If you want to access these collections and see more for yourself, there are many digitized online. So there's 2 things that can help you to do research from home. If you'd rather do it from the comfort of your own armchair, I'm all about it. You can first start with our catalog, which is this one right here, or jump to our digital archive, depending on how you want to do your research. If you have a subject specific thing in mind, start with our catalog. If you want to browse and kind of get inspired, that's where the digital archive directly comes in. You can look through themed collections and get a grasp of what you might be able to find. Or again, to go back to the very beginning of my fast Gilmore Girl talking 10 minutes, you can always come into the archives. We are open. We are a public office. We are literally there to serve you and assist you in your research and what you're trying to find. We recommend you make appointments because we can actually pull material ahead of time and make your visit more efficient, but we are always there and we are always available to assist you. To go a little bit deeper into looking at things from home, if you visit the archives catalog, you have the option for searching. It has better faceted searching. It has a collection organization, as you can see on the right side. And if there's a digital component, it automatically links to that for you. So you can do a little research ahead of time and then maybe come in after that, or do that research ahead of time and then find what you need in the digital archive. Everything in our digital archive is a public record. It can be downloaded from home. You can use it however you wish. If you do use it in a publication, we just ask that you credit the state archives, which is pretty standard. But either way, there's no copyright on these. These are here for your use and enjoyment and research or whatever else. So the last little bit I wanted to say is interact with these collections and build stories. Every record has a story. It's just about finding what that story is and how it fits into the story you may want to tell. A city directory can tell the history of a house, whether it was a 3-family, then a 2-family, then a 3-family. A family history document can tell you about a history of illness in a family. It depends on what you want, but there's always something to be found. Always contact our team. That's State Archives at sos.ri.gov. I know Jody has that information in the handout as well. And I cannot encourage you enough to explore unknown history. kickstart it, browse, get curious, because every time we go looking for something in this collection, it surprises us that we're able to find things as often as we are, considering how small, but I will say small but mighty, Rhode Island is. Very quick general policies that you'll see if you do visit us in person. Like most archives, no materials leave the archive, but we can always make copies or scans for you. If you bring bags, we check them. There's a locker area. And then we are on hand to help you with anything you need. You can take pictures just without flash. Those are really the hit list. I've just hit my 10 minutes on my timer. So I really hope that was a flash in the pan of the state archives for you. And I'll stop sharing. So let's see. There we go. And I'll pass back over to Jody. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Ashley. I love the passion that comes through from all our archivists for history and for the past and the stories that can be found there. And I'm also very happy that the state archives got moved out of a floodplain, because that seems like a really bad place to have an archive.
I could tell you stories. No documents were ever harmed, though, which is the most important part.
Thank you so much, Ashley, and appreciate the nod to credit and copyright and some of the details you included about what to expect when you come into the archive, because I know that's kind of new to a lot of us. So thank you so much for sharing that. We have two more panelists to share with you tonight, and just a quick acknowledgement that we realize this is just 5 archives in the state of Rhode Island. There's so many great archival resources out there. So if there's a great archive that you know of or want to give a shout out to or are part of, please drop information in the chat. We're all about kind of sharing resources here. We'd love to hear about the resources that you've been using. I would like to next introduce Anthony Bells of the Tomaquag Museum. Anthony has been the Tomaquag Museum's archivist since January 2017, while adding the title of collections manager in 2018. He has an associate in arts from Heartland Community College, Bachelor of Science degree in anthropology from Illinois State University, and a master's degree in library and information studies from the University of Rhode Island. Before becoming an archivist, he worked as an archaeologist and has a total of over 14 and a half years experience in the museum field. His research interests include archaeology and history, folklore, oral history, ethnomusicology, writing, research, and preservation science. Anthony, thank you so much for being with us.
You're very welcome. I'm glad to be here. How to condense this all into 10 minutes. So I really appreciate your, actually, your research. It's a research question. So you asked, what are examples of activism and solidarity in our archive? And I'm like, that's a really great question. I don't know. So what really piqued my interest and got me going into what I'm going to present tonight was a newspaper article from the Providence Sunday Journal from November of 1973 entitled Who Speaks for the Narragansett? And it's an interview with Tall Oak Whedon and Princess Redwing, who were second cousins. And as far as I was able to bridge the gap between what solidarity is and what activism is, and trying to ask the question like what those things look like, how are they manifested in the world through writing or art or speaking events or education, how does that work? And what really got me to bridge the gap between solidarity and activism was this article. And I'll share my screen real quick. I'll talk about the picture I found. The first person who came to my mind was Tall Oak Whedon, and this is one of his collages. Hold on a sec. Can you see that? Yes, okay. So Tall Oak Whedon, he recently passed away in February at age 86. He was a member of the American Indian movement in the late 60s, early 70s. He was part of the occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs office in Washington, D.C. You can read all about that later. But he was here at the founding of the museum. He was employed here as an artist in residence. He actually practiced indigenous arts and crafts and learned about them. And that's all he did for a year in the museum in 1959. The museum opened in 1958 and was founded by Eva Butler along with Princess Redwing. Tall Oak Whedon happened to be second cousins with Redwing. Redwing was Wampanoag Narragansett. Tall Oak was Narragansett, Pequot, and Wampanoag. And he, we don't have a lot from Tall Oak. He has donated things to our museum over the years. But in the corner of our exhibit space in the museum, we have several of his collages that he created and donated to us. And this is one of them, The Land of Opportunity. I don't know how well you could see this. Maybe I could zoom in a little bit. You can get some detail, but there's a lot going on here. Yeah, it speaks for itself. I can't say anything about it. You know, he's very strong with his imagery and what he's trying to say. It's not, he's trying not to sugarcoat anything. So I thought it was very important to acknowledge his activism and how it manifests for him is in action, whether it's occupying the Bureau of Indian Affairs or it's making these stark, really bold statements through these collages where he just picks things out of magazines and you know, tells a story here. So to explain some of this and to show how I bridge the gap between activism and solidarity, and you'll forgive me as well, I was literally highlighting this article like 2 minutes before I got on because it really wrapped everything together for me. Bridging into solidarity, and you'll see I'm going to read a couple of these passages just because they're really important. They say more than I ever could because it's from their mouths, and that's part of the originality or the uniqueness of the Tomaquags is from the indigenous perspective, so you have to let them speak through their own voices. And for solidarity, I'm going to talk about the Great Swamp Massacre Memorial and pilgrimage that used to be conducted by the sons and daughters of the first Americans, which Redwing and her husband, White Oak, were the head of and led for many decades until his passing. So the Great Swamp Memorial is in West Kingston. I don't know if that really exists, but that's where it is. It's west of Kingston. And it's a stone obelisk near the site of where the Great Swamp Massacre occurred. And you can read up about that. It was horrible, awful, as you'll see. But this article has a lot of really good information. So the Great Swamp Memorial was erected in 1906. And it says on the monument marker, it says, attacked within their fort upon this island, the Narragansetts made their last stand in King Philip's War and were crushed by united forces of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Plymouth colonies in the Great Swamp Fight, Sunday, 19th December, 1675. That's what it says on the memorial. So, and then they're quoting Tall Oak in this article. It says, the Great Swamp Fight, he says, and his voice bends the word fight into italic wire, was our wounded knee. That's quite amazing. So if you research this massacre, you'll understand why he would say something so basically accurate. And then he goes on to say, it is not a fight, it was a massacre, and the highway sign should call it a massacre. And since he was such an activist, he has to address this here in this third paragraph, and it says, someone even spread the rumor once that I was going to blow up the monument. He says it in a low, precisely articulated voice, because that would be foolish. I want that monument to stay here. As long as it stands, it is proof of what I'm trying to tell people about our history. And let's see the next page. and so this is quoted, now it's quoting Red Wing. They're going back and forth quoting them. It says, 1 year had 4,000 people in the Great Swamp. We lit 3 fires for the past, present, and future. We read our honor roll and gold star roll and had some great military man or politician talk about the Indians. I used to MC that program, but I'm growing tired now and Strong Horse taken over. And then at the end, this is more between the generational differences between the solidarity and activism. Red Wing was born in 1896 and Tall Oak was born in 1936. So there's a 40-year gap between, completely different generational attitude toward indigeneity. So it says here, Tall Oak worked with her at the Tomaquag Museum. She speaks of him in obvious fondness, but points out their differences. She commented on the Thanksgiving demonstrations. I said, Tall Oak, you've got to go over there in the winter and you freeze and you get nothing but their anger. I go down there in the summer when some organization invites me to speak and they treat me like an honored guest and pay me for speaking. I say the same things you do, and they stand there with tears in their eyes asking what they can do to better the Indians. I told him once, Tall Oak, I'm for Indian rights, but you young ones must do the fighting. I'll just keep on talking like I've always done. And then Tall Oak continues, Red Wing is the one person in Rhode Island who single-handedly kept an awareness of our Indian heritage alive when no one else could. Pretty powerful stuff. So Red Wing is very important. I've got a minute left. We've got her archive right now. We have a assistant archivist, Hebe Lee, who's been working on rehousing and organizing her archive, which remained here after she passed away in December of 1987, so 35 years ago. And we just kept everything. Her family didn't want it. It stayed with the museum, and it's just never been fully organized. So he's been spending about the last 2 years just organizing it. And he got to about 20 boxes right now. And it's never ending. We're always finding Red Wing material everywhere. So this Great Swamp was a box of Red Wings. It's entirely of information about the Great Swamp Monument, the pilgrimage, handwritten notes, correspondence, photographs. There's a rich history there, and people need to write about it. So that's my time. All right. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Anthony.
You're welcome.
Really appreciate how you dove into that. What was a prompt, but you took as a weighty research question and really opened up those ideas of activism and solidarity and different ways of thinking them through this particular history. I really appreciate that. And I think it also exemplifies for writers and researchers and artists in the crowd that, you know, bringing your research questions or your ideas to these archivists, you're going to be taken seriously, and you're going to have, you know, someone alongside you to kind of dive into that. So
absolutely. I think I'm going to write a blog post based on this, actually, because I did enough research here that I'm like, all right, I think I got something to say about this. So yes, check out our belongings blog as well. We have different people writing. I write it in the archive series, and visit our archives page on our website. And Cranberry Thanksgiving is this Saturday if you want to come, rain or shine. So it starts at 11 o'clock. Okay, thanks.
Thank you for the invite. Yeah, we'll get a link to the blog and information up in the chat soon. And yes, I love how I was just noticing both Richard and Anthony have these boxes behind them. The like physical archive is present behind you. You're with those artifacts. They're out there. I think we get so used to our virtual interaction that it's really refreshing to see that inspirational material right there. All right. Thanks all. We have one more panelist to share with you tonight, and then we'll open up the chat for your questions. So definitely hang on to those. But before we get to that, I definitely want to introduce Mev Miller to you of Wanderground Lesbian Archives and Library. Since the early 1980s, Mev Miller has developed an extensive library of lesbian and feminist publications, nearly 3,000 volumes and counting. She has been an active participant in the Women in Print movement as a bookseller, editor, writer, reviewer, promoter, and more. She's currently the librarian and instigator creating Wanderground, a community-based lesbian archive library in Rhode Island for the New England region. Mev, thank you so much for coming and sharing with us tonight.
Thanks, I appreciate it. And I too am going to share my screen. Hopefully you can see it. Can you see the screen? Uh-oh, here we go. Let me share the correct thing. There you are. Can you see it? Okay. So thank you all for inviting me. I really appreciate it. I feel like the new kid on the block. And it was hard for me to pick two things because we have so few things. I'm actually going to show you a lot of different things. But basically in Wanderground, our long vision is, and what's behind me is actually a vision board of what I'm hoping Wanderground will become, because we are not anywhere yet. We are in my house at the moment. But the long view is that we will provide a vibrant community of gathering spaces, basically to make lesbians visible, to revitalize our histories, to learn and affirm lesbian identities, and to reclaim our visibility and our voice, our histories, and our creativities of lesbians as lesbians. We're still in development. We're still a startup location with a startup organization with no location yet, as I mentioned, still in my house. We just recently received our nonprofit status just a couple of weeks ago. We do envision ourselves as a lesbian archive for the greater New England region. And so our next steps are to raise funds, expand our collection beyond what I currently have, and to find an accessible and physical space to permanently house what we have. And as Jody mentioned, most of what we have is my own personal collection of books and periodicals, recordings, music, CDs, mostly highlighting lesbian and feminist presses between 1970 to 2000. But we also have a lot of buttons and t-shirts and so on and so forth. And on a regular basis, somebody says, "Hey, I've got a box. Do you want it?" "What's in the box?" I'm like, okay. So we're growing, even though I haven't asked to grow yet, but it's happening. So that's pretty fun to see how it's organically happening. But most of the stuff I had was basically national and international in scope, and not so much about Rhode Island. So a couple of years ago, when I really got serious about thinking about locating a lesbian archive in Rhode Island, my first question was, will anybody care? Is anybody interested in this at all in Rhode Island? And also because my collection is national and international. I've only lived in Rhode Island since 2002, which is significantly after a lot of the lesbian feminist presses were really moving. The activism was really going on between the 70s and 2000. I didn't know what was going on in Rhode Island during that time. So I was able to get a mini research grant from the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities in 2021 and 22 to basically look at this and find out, is there any there, and is anybody interested? And basically what I found out is, yes, there's a lot of interest. I was able to learn more about Rhode Island lesbian communities during that time period between the 70s and 2000. And I was also able to get my hands on specific things that are Rhode Island based about lesbian activism and history during that time. And if you have any interest in looking back at that research, it is on our website. If you go to wanderground.org/programs, there's the weekly blog list there of the different ways I summarize the research, as well as some PowerPoints and author events that we did during that time period. Basically, one of the things I discovered while doing that research is that I love this quote: "Feminist activism in Rhode Island was largely a euphemism for lesbian." So coming out as a lesbian is an activism, really, for many. There were a lot of lesbians involved in many things that were happening in Rhode Island, both in the feminist women's movement, rights organizations, and then gay rights in general, but it was difficult to find lesbians doing lesbian stuff for lesbians. Many lesbians were not out, they were not visible, they were certainly active, forwarding the rights of women, but sometimes you really have to do some creative digging to find out who the lesbians are and what they were up to. One of those examples was from the Feminist Resources Unlimited, which was active between 77 and 2003. Again, a lot of lesbians working in those organizations, but not out so physically, not so out so prominently or publicly necessarily. They were doing a lot of work to against violence against women, a lot of pro-choice work, equal rights amendment, so on and so forth, a lot of organizations, but they were not necessarily out. One of the things that they put together was this Feminist Yellow Pages. There was an edition that came out in 1982. I do not have a copy of that, but I have seen it in other places. But again, the only two mentions of lesbian in this whole 42-page document is the Rhode Island Alliance for Lesbian and Gay Rights and for lesbian services that are announced at the Sarah Doyle Center. So you have to really go finding. And in my opinion, one of the biggest omissions here is RIWA and Oriole are not represented, which I will talk about in a minute. Options is not mentioned in here. And Visions and Voices Bookstore, which is a women's bookstore in the late 1988, might not have been founded by the time when this publication came out, but they did come out later on in 1988, and they only lasted for like 2 or 3 years before they were gone. But one of the other things that came out of the Feminist Resources was this newspaper called The Third Wave. They started as mimeograph sheets, and then eventually they kind of started really as a newspaper. In the Wanderground collection, we have 3 issues of it only that were recently handed to me. One is the premier issue, which has a lot of lesbians who are involved in the publication. But again, it's a feminist publication, not a lesbian publication. But they did cover a few things. Here's the pride thing that's in that particular issue. And the second issue I have, you can see highlighted here, some lesbian events are being suggested. There's the meeting for the Rhode Island Alliance, and there's a Cheryl Wheeler concert and some other things like that that are in the calendar. This particular issue also had a very interesting open letter to folks that says, basically, I'm not out, I'm never going to come out, I refuse to come out, but all the rest of you who are coming out, you're my role model, and thank you for coming out, and please encourage me to keep coming out. So this is a very interesting view of what it's like to be a lesbian in, I think this is 1991, not so long ago, but still, people still afraid to come out, basically. This third issue that I have, this dining out article, is very interesting. It's about lesbians who are writing a review of a restaurant, but they're also writing about what it's like to be a lesbian couple going to a restaurant and the experiences they have as diners in a restaurant. So that's also a pretty interesting piece. If folks are interested in trying to understand what lesbian life is out there in the world, this is something that's and also you see the DeVille's Cafe ad down there in the corner. That is a cafe that was real popular in the lesbian community for a long time before they closed down. Other papers, other third wave issues can be found in the Jody Glass papers at John Hay Library at Brown University, if you have any interest in seeing more of those issues. But like I said, Wanderground has 3 of them, so we're very happy about that. Then there's the Rhode Island Women's Association, a completely different organization. Again, notice it's called Rhode Island Women's Association. It is a lesbian organization, but they never use the word lesbian hardly anywhere. They were founded in 1978 when they gathered because they wanted to have they're a social organization, not so much an activist one. And they call themselves the Professional Women's Organization. And because they wanted an alternative to going to the bars. And so they started this organization. And you had to be 30 in order to be in the group. In 1981, they changed that a little bit. They lowered the age from 25 to 23. They changed their name to the Rhode Island Women's Association because there was some rebellion about the word professional. They thought it was too exclusive. And so they wanted more women to feel like they could be invited. And then they actually put together bylaws in 1983 But then because they lowered the age to 23, the older women in the group were like, wait a minute, this is getting too young for us. We need an old group. And so they called themselves Orioles, which is the Organization of Rhode Island Older Les Energy. This organization is still going on today, still a social group. They do a lot of meetups and stuff around. Prior to COVID, they were doing dances and whatnot, but it was really hard to get their papers. And finally, I was able to get some information from Priscilla and Marge, and they very generously donated a lot of materials to me. So the things that we have in the collection include a history, the actual bylaws, and several drafts getting to the final version of the bylaws, some newsletters, some flyers, meeting reminders, and so on and so forth. So those are a stack of miscellaneous papers that can be gone through to kind of see what was going on with those organizations. Other tidbits in the Wanderground collection, and when I say tidbits, I do mean tidbits. The Rhode Island Alliance Lesbian and Gay Rights, we have their brochure and some scattered minutes from a couple of their meetings. We also have OLOC Rhode Island, which has been in Rhode Island since 2018. It's a local chapter of Old Lesbians Organizing for Change, which is a national organization. I have the agenda and meeting notes and some pictures. I'm the coordinator of the chapter, so I have all the stuff and I can be talked to about an oral history, but it's basically an organization that is part social, but mostly trying to figure out what kinds of activisms we can do to further the rights and better the lives of old lesbians. Other tidbits in the collection are healthcare that Sage Rhode Island put out a couple of years ago for lesbian elders. That was around 2012. We have a photo album that was old lesbians at home during COVID. It was kind of let's take pictures of old lesbians and show that we're still here. Rhode Island Lesbian Resource Guide from 98-99. I have 7 issues of Options. If you want to see a full range of Options newspaper, which is the gay and lesbian paper in Rhode Island, you can actually get that from the Providence Public Library. I think they have a complete set. And then I have some other miscellaneous flyers and things like that. One of the things about trying to find out about lesbians in any context is that we are hidden in many ways. And sometimes you have to be really creative and read between the lines. And you don't want to read too far into it, but as a lesbian, we and many lesbians I know were always like looking like, is she one of us? Is she a friend of Dorothy? Like we're always doing that kind of thing with each other. I was able to acquire this 1994 book that was put out by the Providence Journal about women in Rhode Island history. I was flipping through it one day, just kind of looking to see who was there. And I found this article about Gertrude Johnson and Mary Wales, the founders of Johnson and Wales University. And you read it and you're like, oh, everything around this. I don't know if they are lesbians or not, but in my imagination, they probably are, just because when you read the description, you can write up a whole story, make up a whole lot of things about their lives, just based on what this little vignette is of their story. So it's, sometimes we have to be really creative. The last thing is that when I also have some books. We gathered these during the research program, and I was able to put an exhibit in the Providence Public Library between June and August. We featured the writings of some Rhode Island lesbians. So we do have some books that we gathered during that research. If you want to access the Wanderground collection, like I say, it's in my house. So I've arranged with Jody that I will come and sit at What Cheer Writers Club on these dates, which I believe are also on the handout and in the chat. Or you could contact me if there's something in particular you're really interested in seeing. I will be sure to bring that along. I could probably fit everything in a box, but it would be better to know what you actually want to see. And you can always contact me or join the mailing list for Wanderground. And thank you very much. And I don't know where I am with time, but there it is.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mev. We really appreciate your work in bringing all those that collection together, and good luck with the newly founded nonprofit. We're excited to see where it goes. And thank you for taking the time to open the access this month of October. We'd love to see folks come on through the club at those times. And Mev, I also really appreciated what you said in terms of, you got me thinking about how some histories, like you said, some hidden histories or histories that maybe had to go, stories that had to go underground in our past for whatever reason, actually can open up a creative window for you fiction writers out there, you know, taking some of these tidbits and doing the research, but, you know, letting your imagination play with them. There's a lot of opportunity there. So we hope you'll take advantage of that. Susanna just uploaded the access guide, as we call it, in the chat. You can download that from the chat. We'll also email it out. It's all the information you need to access these archives. Again, we're making sure that all the research fees are waived for the month of October, so you can get out there or reach out to these experts with your research questions. Speaking of which, we have a little time here for some questions, so please feel free to drop those in the chat, and we'll keep an eye on that and direct them to the panelists. If you have a specific one for someone, you can name them. We can keep the questions broad and applicable to everyone. You know, we have that access info if you want to bring your specific project to an archivist in the future. To start us off, Susanna, do you want to start us off with a launch question here? And again, please feel free to use the chat to ask your questions.
Sure. So I've done some research in libraries and special collections, and you know, spent a good amount of time there as a writer, but I still find archives kind of intimidating. It helps to meet all of you and hear your excitement about your collections. But I was just wondering if you can kind of, one of you, and Ashley kind of touched on it, but one of you could just say what some of the protocols are to protect the materials and just what people should expect when they come to the archive, so that it's a little less intimidating how we frame our questions, just like what to expect when we walk in the door.
I can, since you mentioned me, I can pop in with two very quick pieces of advice. I could talk for a long time about that, but when you're talking about visiting an archive and going through the resources, the biggest piece of advice I give researchers for any type of topic is go slowly. One of the most important things when it comes to archives is we keep things in order, right? The original order that the donators kept them in. It's part of the record. So moving very carefully to not damage records. So take your time, don't be afraid to take your time. And then taking that time to also keep things in an order is going to make you an archivist favorite visitor ever. If you're following those protocols really easily. I will say the other thing, when you're talking about coming up with research questions, never underestimate the really great concept of what we call a reference interview, which if you've done research at a library or asked a librarian at your neighborhood library how to find a mystery book that has baking as the theme, you've been in a reference interview. So that's when you come to our team members at any archive with maybe a broader research question, and there's a little bit of repartee where we can ask and try and pull from what you've said, what we may have. So don't be afraid of a conversation, because those questions are what is going to enrich your research and make sure we bring you what you want. Like, that's the big thing, because there's often many resources that could fit. So drilling down really requires a conversation and curiosity for both parties. If that makes sense? But I'll let somebody else chime in. That's my 2 cents.
I would also say that, I mean, we're still new, so we don't have a place for you to come and look just yet. But one of the things that is really important for us is to really make the materials as accessible as possible. We want people to be able to browse and to look and to, because you don't know what you don't know. And sometimes I find that when I'm looking for stuff, librarians are great, archivists are great, they want to help me, but sometimes I can't articulate what it is I want. And so I like to browse. That's a personal preference I have, because I'll know it when I see it, kind of thing. And so that's one of the things we aim to do as much as we can with Wanderground, is to make it as touchable as possible, obviously not to hurt our chances of, not to compromise the materials, I guess is what I'm trying to say, but also to make it possible for folks to really look and find what they think they want because they don't know what they want. But again, no food, no drink, keep your bags out, have a pencil, a piece of paper, but don't do anything that's going to compromise the materials.
Yeah, I mean, following that up, I suppose every house has its rules, and there are similarities and differences. So respect the house rules as best you can. Ashley's comment about being slow or going slowly is good. I love this quote. One said, "The one thing a scholar should not save is time." And maybe a writer might think about that as well. Just remember that your deadlines aren't ours. But we respect them as best we can. And again, I think that when I was at Providence Public Library Special Collections, a lot of RISD folk came in to look at graphic stuff, and very much like what you say, Mev, you can't show an artist a card catalog, and it's not a very effective kind of way for them into that. And so. But the problem is that part of the public trust is keeping the thing safe, and it's tough. The larger you are and the more material you have, especially if it's not very well cataloged, the more vulnerable it is to humans. And so there. But I will tell you that most archives and most places, the whole reason for their existence is for you to access this, or it should be. Otherwise, it's just a tomb. So there's no reason for that. So that if you have trouble, I will say this as an administrator, if you go into an archive and they're obstructive and restrictive, go up the chain. Because that's something that as an administrator of an archive, I do not want. I don't want to hear that my people are barring access. Now, I mean, I'll listen to what the problem is, but for the most part, I'm here to cut that red tape and to get folks what they need. So.
Anyone else want to weigh in before we go to the chat? All right, we've got a couple questions. Thank you for your responses, by the way. We've got a couple questions that maybe are related. Thank you, Catherine, is that noting that the tutorial on using the archives would be great for history teachers. What kind of outreach might you be doing to help a teacher know what resources are available to their students? And related to that, Betsy was particularly interested in connecting with you, Anthony, in the museum to work to collaborate with some students about the upcoming Indigenous Peoples Day. So are there opportunities set up within any of your archives for teachers to connect with these resources?
At State Archives, yes, but go ahead, Sunny.
I guess I was just going to jump in because as many know or should know, Rhode Island now has a law for African heritage history in K through 12, and we've been developing that curriculum. But specifically for teachers, we've been reaching out because we're creating a web learning portal that's going to allow teachers to go in and search for information on Rhode Island history for their classrooms. And we're hoping that we can get some teachers that want to see the framework that we've started. It's starting with high school, but we've been talking to teachers now for a few years as we've been trying to develop this. And I love getting teachers' calls. I love it when they call and they say, we want to do this project in my class, and what can you do to help? And, the entire staff will jump in because we love that. So I think that for resources for teachers, it is out there. It's just a matter of calling and telling us what you want.
Great, and I'll definitely check the chat for, thank you, Sunny, and check the chat for Ashley's note on connecting classrooms to the state archives. All right, I'm gonna keep going with the questions. And again, we have a little bit more time. If you do have a question, get it in the chat and we'll make sure to address it. If someone has a very general idea of what they want to research, do you have suggestions for how they can narrow down and make best use of the collection? Or are there ways that you could help us focus and get to that kind of research question? Is that part of your work?
Well, go ahead, Rick, if you have an answer. Otherwise,
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that I'm not, first of all, I don't want to put I'm not a trained archivist. I'm an instigator and a librarian, and I've been a bookseller for 40 years. And so my experience comes from when a customer comes in and says, I'm looking for something, something, something. And I'm like, so for me, the way to approach that is to just ask a series of questions. And so based on what you're looking for, I would probably try to just hone in on, well, do you mean this or that? Do you want red or blue? Are you looking for general or specific? Are you looking for, what do you look, I mean, I just try to add, based on what your initial statement is, I would just continue to drill down and see if we can. And then I'd probably come up with too many things for you to look at, because that's what I do, too many things for you to look at, and then have you then look at that and then see if we can't narrow it down from there. So that would be my approach, really just kind of working with you to figure out how you can articulate better what it is you're really looking for, because it goes into that category of you don't know what you don't know. And so that's kind of how I would approach it.
Yeah, I mean, as Ashley said, that's a kind of, the industry calls it a reference interview. Some people call it, I would call it information therapy in a way, because basically, again, sometimes you don't, like you say, you don't know what you don't know. You don't know what you want. I haven't articulated, you're kind of trending towards something. And if you really don't know a subject, again, your local reference librarian or a reference librarian at a college or university library, if you have access to that, could start you on the way to sort of answering those questions. Here's a general history, or here's a general, treatment of that. Here's a bibliography that lists all kinds of sources related to those things. That's what librarians are for. It's what we're trained to do. It's what we want to do. We will also bury you in resources if you let us halfway. But a good one, a good reference interview will actually, like a good editor, make, refine what you already want that you didn't quite know, and show you possibilities that you weren't aware of. So that's what I would say.
I think the only very brief thing I would add is, if you are comfortable doing so, looking at whichever institution you're interested in's web content, not necessarily for the deep dive, but do not be afraid of subject hyperlinks. They will be your best friend. Like, similar to when I go back to public library catalogs as an example a lot, because there's more similarity than you may think between an archive catalog and a library catalog, because their purpose is very similar. So if you find a book you like and you click on the author's name for more books in your public library catalog, when you're in an archive catalog, if you find a resource that's of interest, 9 times out of 10, in that listing, you're going to find other resource links, either by subject or creator, that you can click. And that can guide your research a little bit. So hopefully, with myself and the other panelists, you're less intimidated by talking to an archivist or a special collections librarian. But if you're still feeling a little nervous, check those things out, because that will send you on your own rabbit hole, and then you can have those bigger conversations with us as well.
Exciting. Well, I hope we're all ready to dive down the rabbit hole. I wanted to just mention again, as I did at the top of the event, that What Two Writers Club is going to be putting out a call, hopefully before the end of the month, for submissions to a zine anthology that kind of brings together stories around activism and these ideas of solidarity and social change in Rhode Island. They can be related to the past or the present, but we'd love for people to use these archival resources to inspire those submissions. So if you do have your own research questions or questions related to these topics, don't hesitate to reach out to these folks or other local archives. We'll go ahead and get that document up in the chat one more time. We'll also get a link to the survey about tonight's event. We would love your feedback. That's very helpful to us in terms of reporting to our grant funders and also providing more tailored programming that you want to see in the future. So we really appreciate that. I want to say a huge thanks to our panelists for being here tonight, for putting together such thoughtful presentations that really open up our minds to the sources of inspiration that are out there in our state, and also to those particular histories and stories that we might not have been aware of. It was really inspirational. So we really appreciate your time with that. And thank you all for being here and spending an evening with us diving into the archives. It was lovely to see you. Thank you, everyone.
You're welcome.
Have a wonderful night.
You too.
Thank you.